zero emission vehicles that's been put into this particular budget, because I think that that's going to get us there. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Regina Louvain. No? Yes? Regina Louvain.
Madam Speaker, and I do enjoy listening to my colleague Crossway's speeches, and he talked about electric vehicles, and I'm very interested in that. And this is, we usually have a clever back and forth, but a serious question. In his budget, in the Liberals' budget, Madam Speaker, how much money was put to increase the capacity of the electrical grid? How much money was put in place to make sure that when these electric cars are all here, because I hear Toronto's is about 90–95% capacity for their electrical grid, how much money have they put into the infrastructure of increasing the electrical grids across Canada so that they can actually charge these electric cars? And please, I hope the answer isn't the infrastructure bank.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I appreciate the question, Madam Speaker, but the member is assuming that the entire technology is going to remain stagnant and it's not going to change. In order to, what's going to happen, Madam Speaker, is it's going to become easier to charge, it's going to become faster to charge. Listen, I'm going to tell you right now, Madam Speaker, 10 or 15 years from now, you won't need charging stations anywhere other than in your own home. You won't need charging stations other than in your own home, Madam Speaker. You will see them along a highway at various different stops, but you won't see them to the degree that you're seeing them throughout city streets right now, because the reality is that the technology is going to advance so quickly that a single charge in your home will be long enough to do your daily tasks.
I'm going to get the clerks to hold on to the time. There is a lot of sound coming here, but not just here, but on the outskirts. So I'm hoping that maybe we can have the Sergeant at Arms or somebody talk to anybody who's on the outside of the lobby to let them know that maybe they should be taking their conversations away from the House of Commons, because it's very hard to hear what's going on. Even though the honourable member, I know, has a pretty loud voice, so that he's trying to be very clear. Resuming questions et commentaires, l'honorable député de Jonquière.
The honourable member for Jonquière. Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's quite ironic to hear the member for Kingston and the Islands talk about his government investing in transport when Canada is not funding clean energy. It's one out of every 40 billion for oil versus clean energy, but his government seems to be happy with this poor performance. But if I were him, I would be quite embarrassed by this performance. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I apologize because of the noise. I didn't get the entire question. But I think that the member was getting at oil subsidies versus renewable subsidies. The problem with talking about oil subsidies, and it's what unfortunately the NDP do quite a bit, is that they build into the subsidies that they talk about the orphan well, the money that goes towards dealing with orphan wells. Yes, there are a lot of orphan wells out there that the federal government has chosen to be a part of solving the long-term implications of these, and I believe that it's very important for the government to do that. Now, if we're going to lump into that or assume that that is part of a subsidy, well, I would suggest that that's more part of making sure that we deliver on our commitment to the environment.
So we need to get to statements. I just want to remind the member that he'll have 2 minutes for questions and comments when the debate continues on this particular bill. Statements by members, déclaration de député, the honourable member for Brampton Centre.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Canada and the Republic of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan's 19 million people live in a country the size of Quebec and Ontario combined. It has strong multi-ethnic and multi-denominational roots. Kazakhstan's plains, mountain, and climates are like Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, and it is also blessed with the similar resources. It is Canada's largest commercial partner in Central Asia. Kazakhstan is an important regional player, and it is a strong partner for Canada in many multilateral forums and international organizations. Canada is a strong supporter of Kazakhstan's continuing democratic, judicial, and administrative reforms, such as those announced earlier this year by President Tokayev. I hope Canada and Kazakhstan continue to enjoy strong and deepening bilateral relations over the coming decades. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable member for Regina Louvain.
Madam Speaker, this weekend, families across Canada will be celebrating the glue that holds the pieces together. Mother's Day is the one day of the year where loving, hardworking, and dedicated moms finally get the attention, love, and gifts they deserve. Whether it's getting us up for practice on time, keeping us fed and watered, or knowing just what to say to help us overcome the latest world-ending issue, where would any of us be today without the love and encouragement of our moms? They say no love can match a mother's love for her children, Mr. Speaker. I'm so fortunate to see these words acted out every day in my own house. My wife, Larissa, is the most amazing mother to our sons, Nixon and Jameson, and daughter, Claire. Sometimes I just sit back in awe of her and how well she does in the organized chaos that is our life. Of all the special joys in life, the big ones and the small, a mother's love and tenderness is the greatest of them all. I'd like to wish all mothers around Canada a happy Mother's Day. Larissa, happy Mother's Day.
The honourable member for Toronto Danforth.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yesterday, in this place, we began the debate about lowering the voting age. In honour of that moment, I'd like to hand the mic over to members of my Youth Council. From Jessica, adolescents at the age of 16 are at the point in their lives where they are most engaged in their communities as they are starting to get jobs, driver's licenses, and in general, getting involved in society. Getting adolescents involved with voting can lead to more long-lasting participation in democratic activities throughout their life. Now, Safiq was less sure, but Safiq says maybe we can incorporate a debate on how to educate youth before making this leap so they can educate themselves to take it seriously. And from Jonah, giving youth a vote will offer an additional perspective and will make voting results more well-rounded. Youth have very different eyes when looking at the world, so giving the older youth a vote will make our system a better democracy. Thank you to my Youth Council. I will always be there to amplify your voice.
L'honorable député de Pierre-Boucher, les Patriotes Verchères.
The honourable member for Pierre-Boucher, les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Madam Speaker. In 1672, Intendant Talon granted the seigneury of Varennes to René Gauthier, an officer in the Carignan-Salière Regiment and governor of Trois-Rivières. Many people are unaware that the Varennes of today came out of 4 other seigneuries, Cap de la Trinité, Cap Saint-Michel, La Guillaudière, and Ile Sainte-Thérèse. New France saw the birth of none other than Sainte Margaret Duville, founder of the Grey Nuns. The municipality is prized for the quality of its religious heritage, with its sanctuary, chapels, Calvary, and the magnificent St. Anne's Basilica. Varennes remained an agricultural town until the end of the 20th century, when its industrial development coincided with the rush to the suburbs and an explosion in its population. This prosperity allowed the people of Varennes to acquire quality infrastructure and services, so much so that they rose to the top of the list of happy cities in 2019. And so I'd like to congratulate them on that, on their 350th anniversary. The honourable member for Nickel Belt.
Speaker, May 5th is recognized around the world as the Day of the Midwife. It's a day to recognize the contribution that midwives make to ensure safe, quality reproductive and newborn care to families, mothers, and babies everywhere. Thank you to the Greater Sudbury Midwives and the Canadian Association of Midwives for providing leadership and advocacy for midwifery. Thank you to the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives, which exists to promote excellence in reproductive health care for Inuit, First Nations, Métis communities. Au Canada,
in Canada, we have 2,200 midwives providing primary health care and 120 Indigenous midwives who are well positioned to address the unique challenges faced by rural communities. Today, on International Day of the Midwife, I invite you to celebrate and thank Midwifery and Indigenous midwives for the health care they provide to Canadian women. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yellowhead.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to acknowledge all graduates for their achievements in receiving their much-coveted diploma. This graduation season brings an air of happiness, relief, and celebration as students attain their first big achievements as young adults graduating high school. I want to take this opportunity to remind all graduates that we are incredibly proud of them and their achievements. I want all graduates to know that we look forward to all their future endeavors, regardless of the paths they choose to take. I want all graduates to build a life where they can look back and marvel at both their triumphs and perseverance. But most importantly, I want them all to pursue true happiness, however they may define it. I want students to limitlessly dream and not to listen to others telling them what they can or cannot do, because it's their life. And it's up to them to establish their own goals and have the world benefit from their legacies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Parkdale High Park.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to welcome Mr. Pempa Sering, the Sikyong, or President of the Central Tibetan Administration, Tasha Delek. He is here to spread awareness about the lack of linguistic, religious, and cultural freedoms for Tibetans. He's here to advocate for the middle way, an approach crafted by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which simply seeks genuine autonomy for Tibet within the framework of the People's Republic of China. The Sikyong is here calling for a resumption of the Sino-Tibetan dialogue, and he is here to raise awareness about the whereabouts of the Panchen Lama. At the time of his abduction by the CCP in 1995, Gaiden Choki Nyima was 6 years old, making him the youngest political prisoner in the entire world. He's not been seen in public for 27 years. Today in Parliament, the Sikyong is accompanied by the Venerable Tenzin Rabgyal, the abbot of the Panchen Lama's monastery. I ask all members of this House to take up the cause of Tibetans' struggle for basic human rights and to join me in welcoming these two Tibetan leaders. Tuji Che.
The honourable member for Labrador. There you are.
All of those recognize that the 2022 Atlantic Canada Craft Awards for excellence, and give a big shout out to the entrepreneurs from Newfoundland and Labrador who won several prestigious awards. The Craft Council of Newfoundland and Labrador was awarded for excellence as an industry leader. The award recognized superior leadership in the development of craft and contributions to the industry in Atlantic Canada. Through the efforts of staff and volunteers, the organization has found new and exciting ways to promote craft makers, creating new opportunities and new markets. I recognize the exceptional work of Ms. Rowena House, Ms. Shannon Reed, and Mr. Bruno Vinaz and their team. I also acknowledge the Newfoundland Salt Company, who was named recipients as an outstanding exporter. Pete Burt and Robin Crane has taken pride in their products. The company sends their finer salts to 18 restaurants throughout the province and over 40 restaurants across the rest of Canada. And closer to home, Mr. Speaker, the incredible craft boutique of Slippers and Things in Happy Valley Goose Bay and receiving the Outstanding Retailer Award. I congratulate Mike Visey and his daughter Natasha, who continue to showcase the Labrador culture through crafting and design with their handmade slippers, using patterns that are traditions that have passed down through generations of the Voisey family. Their products are unique and a sense of pride for all the people of Newfoundland and Labrador.
I need to remind everyone that, of course, statements by members, SO31s, are 60 seconds in length. The honourable member for Mission Masquet, Fraser Canyon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May 5th is Dutch Heritage Day, and May is Dutch Heritage Month in Canada. For all Canadians, it is a time we commemorate Canada's special relationship with the Netherlands. Dutch Heritage Day recognizes the sacrifices made by Canadians in the liberation of the Netherlands, as well as the contributions made by Canadians of Dutch heritage. This day is celebrated as well in the Netherlands, as it is the anniversary of their liberation from Nazi Germany in 1945, where Canadian soldiers played an integral role. On May 5th, the gift of freedom is celebrated. Like so many Canadians of Dutch descent, stories from our elders and grootouders shape not only our concept of Canada, but the lasting bond between our nations. And for Canadian veterans and their families, it is a reminder of Canada's contribution in the fight against tyranny. Thank you to our veterans, and thank you to the thousands upon thousands of Canadians of Dutch descent who made this country what it is today. Vrede bin Vredingstaat, happy Dutch Heritage Day.
The honourable member for Bonavista, Buren Trinity.
Mr. Speaker, 2022 has been designated Come Home Year in my province of Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm inviting everyone to come visit or return back to our beautiful province and discover all the unique and wonderful things Newfoundland and Labrador has to offer. There are endless things to see and do in our province and in my riding of Bonavista, Beer and Trinity. Along our stunning coastlines, you can go whale watching, puffin watching, iceberg hunting, see breathtaking cliffs and vistas. You can visit our UNESCO Global Geopark on the Bonavista Peninsula, or for a look into the geological past. Maybe see the Northern Lights or hike one of the many breathtaking trails. You can visit our picturesque rural outports and perhaps catch your own codfish for supper. You may even get to dance a jig or get screeched in. Whether you were born or not, in Newfoundland and Labrador, we hope everyone comes and experiences the culture, beauty, and hospitality of Newfoundland and Labrador. Mr. Speaker, long may your big jib draw.
The Honourable Member for Fundy Royal.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals' Soft on Crime Bill C5 will end mandatory jail time for serious crimes like robbery with a firearm, extortion with a firearm, and weapons trafficking. Liberals are also using this bill to allow criminals who benefit financially from human trafficking or people charged with sexual assault to serve their sentence from home. These are violent crimes, but the Liberals don't consider these to be serious offenses. Of course, victims and those that support them know that that is simply not the case. Just last week, the executive director of the London Abused Women's Centre told the Justice Committee that putting an offender back in the community puts women at higher risk. This bill flies in the face of those who call on this government every day, asking for safer streets and safer communities. And it is an absolute affront to victims. This government must stop trying to tip the scales of justice in order to benefit violent criminals over their victims and survivors.
The Honourable Member for Flamborough-Glenbrook.
Mr. Speaker, today, as has been noted, is Dutch Liberation Day. And as a Canadian of Dutch heritage, this day has special meaning to me, my family, and many of my constituents. Personal accounts truly underscore the emotion of the day. In 2015, my mother Sarah returned to the Dutch village where she was born for celebrations of the 70th anniversary. And out at Quebec on the IJssel, there was a parade and music on the evening of the 4th. But on May the 5th, she traveled to the town where the Nazi surrender of Holland was signed. My mom's enduring memory is of the thousands and thousands of young people lining the streets and continuously clapping and cheering the Canadian veterans as they paraded by. Imagine that, 70 years later, Dutch youth born decades after the war, showing eternal gratitude to Canada. Mr. Speaker, if that isn't a testament to the love of liberty that the Canadian Dutch people share in common, I don't know what is.
The Honourable Member for Glengarry Prescott Russell.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in House today on Red Dress Day, a national awareness day for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls called attention to this tragedy and emphasized the need for all of us to address the pain and injustice. This is a horrible tragedy for Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people, and we need to make sure the recommendations become a reality. For those who had the courage to speak out, we continue to honor them, and it is our duty as parliamentarians not only to raise awareness among Canadians, but also to take action to put an end to this tragedy. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
I rise to amplify the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Reclaiming Power and Place, the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls found that, quote, Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA peoples are holders of inherent Indigenous rights, constitutional rights, and international and domestic human rights. The report calls on the full implementation on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Calls for Justice 1.2 states, we call upon all governments with the full participation of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA peoples to immediately implement and fully comply with all relevant rights instruments, including but not limited to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow, a commemorative plaque will be unveiled at the old train station in St. Jerome to honour the memory of Father Antoine Labelle, now recognized as a historical figure of national interest. He was the parish priest of St. Jerome from 1868 till his death in 1891, and at the same time, Deputy Minister of Agriculture and Colonization from 1888 to 1890. The man who was nicknamed the King of the North participated in the founding of some 20 parishes and settled nearly 5,000 inhabitants. He also made 2 trips to Europe to stimulate French immigration to Quebec and Western Canada. He also contributed to the establishment of many industries, and in particular, he convinced Jean-Baptiste Rolland to set up his renowned paper company here in May 1882. Father, King of the North, your memory is inspiring and will continue to inspire us for a long time to come. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Langley Aldergrove.
Mr. Speaker, 77 years ago, May 5th, 1945, the Canadian Army finally liberated the Dutch people from Nazi occupation. It was a welcome end to a fierce, year-long campaign starting at Normandy, continuing through a bitter cold winter, and finally ending with the liberation of Arnhem and surrounding cities. The victory came at a high cost, 7,000 Canadian lives, but it is also the start of a long and celebrated friendship between the people of Canada and the very grateful people of the Netherlands. This friendship gave birth to a huge influx of Dutch immigrants shortly after the war, my parents included, and is still celebrated on both sides of the ocean today. So to Canada once again, thank you for standing up for freedom, justice, and democracy. And to my many fellow Canadian citizens of Dutch origin, let's keep working to keep Canada strong and free.
Good job. Member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Vladimir Kara-Murza is possibly the bravest man in Russia today. Having been poisoned twice by Putin's operatives, he chose to return from a comfortable and safe life in Washington to Moscow, knowing full well that could lead to imprisonment or even death. Shortly after arriving, he gave an interview to CNN denouncing the Putin government as a regime of murderers. True to form, the Putin thugs arrested him, jailed him, and will certainly sentence him to a lengthy imprisonment. It's not inconceivable, Mr. Speaker, to say that Canada and other Western nations would not have Magnitsky sanctions without the incredibly brave efforts of Sergei Magnitsky, Bill Browder, and Vladimir Kara-Murza. Putin hates these sanctions because they are so effective in targeting his closest allies, the oligarchs, and in shining the light on the poisoned money of Russian corruption. Vladimir Kara-Murza is a very brave man, and he deserves our support. Shortly, I will call upon this House to pass a unanimous consent motion demanding the release of Vladimir Kara-Murza. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Now, before we go to question period today, I'd like to return to the points of order raised yesterday, May 4th, 2022, concerning the remarks made during oral questions. First, the House Leader of the official opposition alleged that the Prime Minister had used unparliamentary language. The Chair listened again to the proceedings during question period, and I must admit that with all the noise in the House, I was unable to determine what may have been said. Under the circumstances, I can only ask member to observe the normal rules of debate and decorum in this House and to avoid disrespectful remarks. As I also mentioned yesterday, I heard unparliamentary language from both sides of the House. I further reiterate that none of these remarks should be made in this place. Further, for his part, the member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola, argued that a question put to the Prime Minister by the member for Pontiac had nothing to do with the administrative nature of government. Je désire de rappeler la...
I would like to remind all members that question period is an opportunity for members to obtain information from the government and to hold it to account. However, our rules require that questions be within the government's administrative responsibility. After listening to the question again, the Chair admits that it had no direct link to the government's overall responsibilities or the specific responsibilities of one of its ministers. Instead, it asked the Prime Minister to comment on the words and gestures of another political party. In future, such a question will be deemed out of order. I invite members to take these guidelines into consideration when next they speak. We will be starting question period in a few moments, and I hope that it will be less tumultuous than it was yesterday. I urge members to remember that moderation is always in good taste.
And before we start, for those of you who are maybe the blood pressure's a little high, it's a beautiful day outside. Go for a walk. Oral questions. Question orale. Honorable.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, yesterday in question period I raised a major issue facing Canadians. The endless delays in getting service from the federal government. Passport, employment insurance, revenue agency, immigration, it's all going wrong. As usual, the Prime Minister avoided answering the question, turning his back on thousands of citizens who are waiting, and are still waiting, Mr. Speaker. There is a solution. Get federal employees back to work in their offices, like most Canadian businesses. When will the Prime Minister make Services Canada meaningful again? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you for the question, Mr. Speaker. Our government fully understands the importance of serving Canadians, especially now that our economy is rebounding so strongly. I must highlight that I don't fully agree with the MP across the way, with the idea that everything is going badly in Canada. The truth of the matter is that according to the IMF, we have the most rapid G7 economic growth this year and next year. Thanks to the work of Canadians, I'd like to thank them for that. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. When the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Finance doesn't take an interest in the services proffered by her own government, this is very, very worrying. Public servants themselves are asking Canadians to call their MPs' offices in order to get basic services, Mr. Speaker. We knew that the first 10-year passports were due to expire in 2022 before the pandemic. Services Canada processed 3 million passports a year. We are just getting back to normal now, and federal employees themselves are caught off guard because there was no planning from this Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. Misplaced documents, overwhelmed phone systems. The list of excuses is endless. Can the Prime Minister give us a bit of hope and tell us when federal employees will be back in their offices serving citizens? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, To start off, I would like to thank the public servants for the service that they offer to Canadians. They do work throughout the country. I travelled throughout the country yesterday. I thanked Department of Finance officials who do excellent work, and I know that public servants from coast to coast to coast work diligently. And I think that everyone in this House must acknowledge the efforts that they put forward. The Honourable Member from Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, what the federal employees want is to be supported by their government. What federal staff want is to serve Canadians, Mr. Speaker. What federal public servants want is to be proud of their work at the end of the day because they were given the tools necessary to deliver services that Canadians expect of them. What this government does is improvise and make it that federal employees and public servants cannot do their jobs. Simple question. Will the Prime Minister finally ask federal public servants to go back to the office to serve Canadians? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I would like to highlight once again how we on this side of the House are truly proud of our public service and of all the federal government's workers who do exceptional work and who have done exceptional work during the entirety of the pandemic. And I would like to ensure public service workers and public servants that we are here to help them out by doing what they would like to do, which is helping Canadians.
Halton Hills. Mr. Speaker, Line 5 is being threatened yet again with another shutdown through an application filed in U.S. federal court. This would cut off gasoline, diesel, propane, and jet fuel supplies to Ontario and Quebec. So has the Prime Minister picked up the phone and talked to President Biden to get this matter resolved, or will he have to invoke the 1977 treaty just to talk to the White House about this matter, as he had to do last year when Governor Whitmer of Michigan threatened to shut down the same pipeline?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member opposite for the question because it gives me the opportunity to assure Canadians that our government absolutely understands the importance of Line 5. We understand today more than ever how important energy security is, and I want to assure Canadians our government is always ready to stand up for Canada's rights, including our treaty rights in our relationship with the United States. We have a constant conversation about energy security with the U.S. I spoke to Secretary Yellen just 2 weeks ago on this issue.
Member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the government says Line 5 is important to the government. It supplies over almost half of Ontario and Quebec's energy needs. So if it's so important, why isn't the government opposing the application made in U.S. federal court to shut down this pipeline?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians can have no doubt whatsoever about our government's preparedness and our government's ability to stand up for the Canadian economy and for Canada's treaty rights, including in our relationship with the United States. We absolutely understand the importance of Line 5. We understand the importance of energy security. I spoke with Secretary Yellen just 2 weeks ago and talked about energy security and pointed out to her how important our relationship is to them.
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, I think that clearly there is an immigration crisis. When the Bloc asked the Prime Minister, would it not be good for Quebec to obtain more power in immigration? Never did the Prime Minister talk about a solution. He said, and I quote, "It will always be Canada that will, for the most part, manage immigration," which is unfortunately for the Bloc Québécois, Quebec is not a nation or a country yet. Is it by sheer stubbornness that the Prime Minister refuses to collaborate more effectively and efficiently when it comes to immigration in Quebec? Is that the truth? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we know that immigration is essential for Canada's economy and the economy of Quebec. And like the MP across the way knows full well, Quebec establishes its own immigration policies and numbers, rather. We will always work hand in hand with the Quebec government in order to make sure that the immigration system continues to work for Quebecers and for all Canadians. The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, I think that there's a disconnect. When Quebec asks for immigration powers to meet the crisis full on, the Prime Minister simply closes the door, saying that Quebec isn't a country and that it's Canada's job to do so. Well, Mr. Speaker, then they should do the job. They should do it for the 28,000 immigrants chosen by Quebec, 29,000 immigrants chosen by Quebec who live in Quebec and who would like to settle in Quebec, but whose files simply are not processed. The machine is broken. If the government refuses to repair it and refuses to allow Quebec to work with it, what are we meant to do? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, our government has a very close and effective collaboration with the government of Quebec. Last year, for example, Quebec welcomed more than 50,000 new permanent residents, and this year they've significantly increased their objectives when it comes to immigration, which will contribute to reducing processing delays. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry cited housing and homelessness over 200 times in its final report. Indigenous women are not inherently vulnerable. This is a result of colonization. Access to safe, secure, affordable housing can play a key role towards stopping this genocide. Yet the Liberals has consistently failed to ensure there is a dedicated housing strategy for Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit. Will the Prime Minister take immediate action to correct this gross oversight, or will he allow this ongoing genocide to continue?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. I'm glad to be able to start by recognizing that today is Red Dress Day, and on this day we mourn and honor missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ2+ people. I also want to say to the member opposite that our government absolutely agrees with her that housing is an essential part of the problem and needs to be an essential part of the solution. That is why housing was a core focus of the budget we tabled last month, including absolutely investing in Indigenous housing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Churchill-Kawadanogaski.
Mr. Speaker, there is not one community in northern Manitoba that hasn't been devastated by the brutal murder or disappearance of an Indigenous woman, girl, or Two-Spirited person. Here at home, people are calling for action to end this genocide, immediate action on the 231 calls to justice, action to end poverty, the housing crisis, and discrimination. Les libéraux disent...
The Liberals say it is important, but where is it in the budget? Enough of the rhetoric. The government must act to ensure that no more Indigenous women, girls, or Two-Spirited people disappear. Let us put an end to this genocide now. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for this very important question. Today is Red Dress Day, and today we honour the women, the girls, and LGBTQ2 people who have disappeared or been murdered.
Is not enough, that we must work every day to end violence against Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ2+ people. That is why the budget includes significant investments in this ongoing work, as did previous budgets, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Mr. Speaker, when I first said that the Liberals' ban on foreign buyers was so full of loopholes, it was like Swiss cheese. I had no idea that the government would give itself the biggest loophole of all in its budget law. Get this, after oil is sent, the government gets to decide if it ever is allowed to come into force. That's right. NDP and Liberal members will vote for the ban that really isn't a ban, and the government can simply ignore a law which really isn't a law. They promised millennials they would take action on housing affordability. Now, why do Liberals make promises that they have no intention of keeping?
Good question. The Honourable Minister of Housing.
How's this for a plan? A plan that will double a housing supply in 10 years, making sure that we support first-time home buyers with a tax-free first-time home buyer savings account, doubling the first-time home buyer tax credit to $10,000, making sure that we extend the first-time home buyer incentive to 2025. In addition to that, cracking down on speculation and unfair business practices while increasing more money and investments in affordable housing. Our plan to ban foreign buyers for 2 years is a credible plan. Theirs was full of misinformation.
The honourable member for Prince Albert.
Mr. Speaker, we welcome U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai to Canada today. We expect discussions with her on subjects like softwood lumber, electric vehicles, and Buy America will produce positive results. In a letter to Mrs. Tai, Congressman Higgins urged her to raise the government's 1% tax on vacant foreign-owned real estate with Canadian officials, as the tax violates the non-discrimination principles of CUSMA. Can the Minister of International Trade please advise whether her lawyers agree with Congressman Higgins that this NDP Liberal tax does violate CUSMA?
Good question. Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
So I thank the member opposite for this question. And it's very important that we're talking about Canada-U.S. relations, as the U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai is presently here in Ottawa meeting with the Minister of International Trade. This underscores how important this relationship is and the work that is ongoing. With respect to his specific question with respect to trade irritants that relate to CUSMA, he knows the extensive work that was done by the now Deputy Minister in terms of engaging in a strong agreement that protects Canadian interests. First point. Second point is that when CUSMA violations are triggered, we've been assertive and will always be assertive in defending Canadian interests and the interests of Canadian businesses to defend their economic success in this country. Merci.
The honourable member for Bellechasse-les-Jumellévis. Mr. Speaker, Canada is experiencing the sharpest rise in inflation since the past 3 decades. Unfortunately, wages are not keeping up, and households are struggling to keep their heads above the water. Nearly 3/4 of Quebecers believe that inflation is a serious problem. What does the government have to say? What do they say? It's a global phenomenon. What does the Prime Minister have to say to families who have made the agonising choices between groceries and housing? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Finance. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives continue to denigrate the Canadian economy with a false discourse. But the truth of the matter is that Canada is very well placed to resisting the economic storm caused by COVID and Vladimir Putin. According to the IMF, we will have the most rapid G7 economic growth both this year and next year. And of course, last week, S&P reconfirmed the AAA credit rating for Canada. The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Jumellévis. So the Minister of Finance is calling our constituents liars, those who come to see us in our offices. The reality is that there has been a 21% increase for a house in the Quebec City area. If you want to buy a house, you have to disburse 21% more than before. Gasoline is at nearly $2 a litre, Mr. Speaker. What do they have to say to Canadians, Quebecers and our constituents who visit us and simply cannot do with this anymore? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Finance. Mr. Speaker, we could think that the Conservatives think that we have a fictive economic policy. Perhaps the Conservatives should note what the former communications officer from Stephen Harper had to say, and I quote, "This is reasonable. This is a budget for a good economy, and that nearly reaches zero budget deficit in 5 years.
Edmonton Riverbend.
Mr. Speaker, I have an email. Rachel and her partner have been renting their apartment but are now expecting a baby. Like most young Canadians, they want a home with just a bit more space. The problem is they can't afford a home and they've been outbid on every attempt. So in the latest budget, it says, don't worry, there's $500. $500? $500 barely covers 2 weeks' rent in most places. This minister is completely out of touch, so should Canadians just simply give up on home ownership while he's minister?
The Honourable Minister of Families.
I would like to congratulate the member opposite's constituents on expecting their baby, because good news, in Alberta, childcare costs have gone down 50%. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I was just in Edmonton and Calgary a couple of weeks ago talking to parents who have benefited from reduced childcare fees, and they have said it's actually the equivalent of a mortgage payment. And so, Mr. Speaker, we are working every single day to help families with affordability, and we're going to keep doing that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We made it to 14 so far. Here's question 15. The Honourable Member for Simcoe North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government's budget rewards failure. The failing infrastructure bank gets more money and an expanded mandate. They're using the same broken model for the $15 billion new innovation slush fund. The underwhelming supercluster program gets a sweet renewal. And of course, the government has ignored inflation warnings, increased the carbon tax, punishing farmers and Canadians. The unpopular housing incentive programs are not being changed. Mr. Speaker, why is breaking up so hard to do?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
From the members opposite on infrastructure is something that's so crucial in this country and creates good jobs right across this country. Mr. Speaker, the Canada Infrastructure Bank has invested in 33 projects, 9 in public transit, 7 in clean power, 5 in green infrastructure. And Mr. Speaker, that member opposite should maybe be careful, because his next future leader said about the Canada Infrastructure Bank that it's a game changer, and municipalities would not have been able to make those investments without it. So we might want to speak to Patrick Brown before he goes too far on this line of questioning.
The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, there is an immigration crisis, and whilst Quebec... Order. Order. Everyone. Let's try this again. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, there is an immigration crisis, and whilst Quebec is asking for more powers to deal with it itself, the Prime Minister's response is quite simply that Canada will continue to do so because Quebec is not a country. Simple as that. Imagine hearing that when you're one of the 29,000 immigrants already living in Quebec, the application of whom is stuck in a broken machine in Ottawa. The government won't help them because Quebec is not a country? Is that really their answer? That's pathetic. Mr. Speaker, has the Prime Minister forgotten that we are talking about real people with real problems? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member is right. Quebec chooses most of its immigrants. And every year, Quebec emits more CSQ than the immigration levels in Quebec. The federal government cannot process more files than requested by Quebec. We can't go beyond Quebec's levels, and we will respect here in this House Quebec's immigration jurisdiction, and we will follow their own plans when it comes to dealing with immigration. The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In order to respond to the labour shortage in the various regions of Quebec, the province is calling on foreign workers, but once accepted by Quebec, Ottawa rejects them. Imagine our companies invest up to $20,000 per candidate. Quebec quickly gives its approval. All this only for the federal government to end up rejecting them under the pretext that these temporary workers apparently might want to stay afterwards. Our SMEs need workers, and they need them now. When will the government demand that its machine stop interfering with Quebec's efforts to meet its labour needs? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, listen. Immigration is essential in fighting labour shortages, and we give priority to those trying to find work in priority domains: healthcare, agriculture, production. Mr. Speaker, over Q1 of 2022, we processed more than 100,000 work permits, nearly double that processed in Q1 2021. We will continue to make sure that Canadian employers have access to staff and employees and labour. The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every year with spring, Quebec farmers need temporary foreign workers. Every year, it's a fight with Ottawa. That is how it is in agriculture, but it is also how it is in a number of sectors of the Quebec economy that particularly affect our regions. Our regions need foreign workers. In the meantime, the federal government delays files, even refusing some. It seems simple to me. Quebec says yes to a worker, Ottawa stamps the application, and then we move on to the next one. No? Why is it always so complicated when Ottawa gets involved? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Immigration. Listen up, Mr. Speaker. I always appreciate questions from this opposition, and I would also always like to thank my colleague for their staunch support for immigration and the work that our federal government is doing for temporary foreign workers, because we know that they play an important role to make sure that we have food safety and security. I would also like to note in this House that these people deserve to be safe. And we have enacted measures over the past months and will continue to accept these people into Canada.
Mashpee Fraser Canyon.
Mr. Speaker, in every federal prison across Canada, the Government of Canada is upholding the right of inmates to choose whether or not they receive a COVID-19 vaccination. Yet the same is not given to correctional officers and public servants tasked with running our institutions. And some of them are even losing their job over this. Why is the Government of Canada applying one set of standards for correctional officers and public servants and another set of rights for federal inmates?
Very good question. The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, from the beginning of the pandemic, we have committed to Canadians that we will protect their health and safety. We have put in place measures to protect workers and our communities. As circumstances change, we adjust these measures, and we have always followed advice from public health experts. We committed to review this policy every 6 months, and that review is underway, Mr. Speaker.
Here, here.
They didn't even know it.
The Honourable Member for Essex.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP Liberal government has said it will discuss changing the vaccination requirements for federal workers, but we've not still heard of any discussions or changes. Many of those who cannot work because they are not fully vaccinated have no benefits and no income. Mr. Speaker, why is the NDP Liberal government continuing to break the backs of working Canadians with these vindictive federal mandates?
Great question. The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said before and again, having a fully vaccinated workforce makes our workforce and our communities safer. And we asked employees to step up, and 99% of the public servants have been fully vaccinated or attested to have been fully vaccinated. We committed to review this policy every 6 months. This review is underway, and any decisions will be based on science and the advice of public health officials. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Niagara Falls.
Mr. Speaker, recently I received a very concerning email from the General Manager of the Buffalo and Fort Erie Public Bridge Authority. He warned the continued use of the ArriveCAN app will result in much longer processing times and lengthy border wait times as we approach the summer tourism season. Further, these border delays will discourage cross-border travel and will continue to adversely impact the hard-hit tourism sector in Niagara. When will the federal government help the tourism sector in Niagara and in Canada by ending the use of the ArriveCAN app?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
I want to thank my colleague for the question. Of course, ArriveCan has been an important tool to protect the country from the spread of the virus. We continue to listen to the advice of our public health care experts, and we're working very closely with the CBSA to ensure that the ArriveCan app is efficient and smooth for trade and travel, which happily is going again. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government has acknowledged that there has been a genocide against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, but their inaction speaks louder than their words. They have had the calls for justice from the National Inquiry for 3 years, but the government has failed to implement them. They are also sitting on money that was allocated in 2021 in response to the calls for justice. And while they drag their feet, Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit are dying. When will the minister implement the calls for justice and get the money out the door and save Indigenous lives?
The Honourable Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member opposite for the passion and the words that she shared with us yesterday and today with respect to murdered and missing Indigenous women, which is a tragedy that sadly is ongoing in this country, and it's only been exacerbated by the pandemic. The monies that we've announced through the last budgetary cycle and the present one are ones that are directly targeted to have a systemic approach to reducing the violence and the insecurity that's constantly felt by women and the tragedy that is ongoing. Unfortunately, the results are trailing, but we need to continue as a country, as a government, as a society in raising this issue and these matters and making sure that everyone can feel safe in this country.
Excellent.
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Indigenous women are dying while the minister makes excuses. Today, media is reporting that Indigenous women make up half the population of incarcerated persons in federal prisons. The over-incarceration of Indigenous women has actually been getting worse under this government. There is a call for justice to put in place a deputy commissioner to oversee Indigenous programs and to work with Indigenous communities. But, surprise, the Liberals haven't gotten it done. When will this government start addressing systemic racism and implement all the calls for justice?
That's right. The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, on today of all days, we must acknowledge the continued legacy of colonialism in our justice system. The vast overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples, including women, is unacceptable. And that's why we're committed to taking action by implementing culturally sensitive training, increased representation of Indigenous peoples in our justice system, the legislation that's being put forward by the Minister of Justice to repeal mandatory minimum penalties, and of course a whole suite of other reforms. I'm committed, and I know my colleagues are on this side of the House, to working with the NDP, with my honourable colleague, to ensure that we walk the path of reconciliation. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today is Red Dress Day, a date for all to remember the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ+ people. A national day for Canadians to reflect and recognize that we must all take action. Indigenous peoples know what their priorities are. They've been voicing their needs, and that culturally appropriate approaches will best help those who need support so they can work towards healing and closure. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations tell us what the Government of Canada is doing to develop accessible and culturally relevant healing programs and support for children, families, and survivors of this national tragedy?
The Honourable Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations.
The pain and loss felt by families and survivors of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and the lack of safety felt today, is a tragedy that's ongoing and has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. Indigenous women and girls have the right to be and feel safe anywhere in this country, and tragically this is not the case today. This can only be achieved by continued investments in shelters, safe spaces, cultural spaces, and housing, coupled with culturally appropriate mental health services. We've made significant, indeed historic investments in the areas, but do recognize that much more work needs to be done, and we'll continue to do this alongside Indigenous partners.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Peterborough-Kawartha.
Our country is in a mental health crisis. The first hurdle to getting help is to seek it out. But the people who have the courage to go and ask for help are being denied that help. People are literally dying, waiting for help. My question is, the Liberals promised $4.5 billion via Canada Mental Health Transfer during the election campaign, which was promised to start in 2022. Yet in recent budget, there is nothing. Zero. There is nothing for the Canada Mental Health Transfer. Why?
The Honourable Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for the question and for the recognition of this as Mental Health Week as we increase the awareness coast to coast to coast. As you know, in 2017, we dedicated $5 billion over the next 10 years. We've added $45 million to develop the national standards that will then become the strategy that then will become the transfer. We have to build this bottom up with those with lived and living experience.
The Honourable Member for Montmagny-Lise-Lés, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, the pandemic has affected all of us. Stress and uncertainty has had a devastating impact on Canadians' mental health. This is Mental Health Week, and it is high time that we do something about the effects the pandemic has had on all Canadians. We need to offer adequate mental health care. But in the budget, there is zilch about mental health care. Why? The Honourable Minister of Mental Health. I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. Mental health is a key part of overall health, and our government has made it a priority. Since 2015, we have made historic investments to support Canadians' mental health, including $5 billion to the provinces and territories to increase access to mental health care, as well as $598 million for a distinctions-based mental health strategy for Indigenous people, $270 million for the Wellbeing Portal, but we need to do more.
Mr. Speaker, just months ago during the election, the Liberal platform made a firm commitment, $4.5 billion over 5 years for Canada Mental Health Transfer, very specifically including $250 million in 2021-22 and $625 million in 2022-23. This promise was clearly broken in the budget. What happened between the election and the budget? Of course, the NDP Liberal agreement to cling to power. As part of that agreement, did the NDP demand that the Liberals break their commitment on mental health in order to fund other NDP priorities?
The Honourable Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
I thank the member for the question and his ongoing advocacy, but I think he's got it a bit wrong in terms of the effect of the NDP coalition on joint.
Hold on. We were doing really well there. We really were. See, let's make sure. Let's have a respectful answer. Respectful, please. The Honourable Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
The word was collaboration, Mr. Speaker, and I want to say that on mental health, we think that there is collaboration across the whole of this House as we go forward, investing in the $5 billion that was in the 2017 budget and moving forward to the federal transfer eventually once we have a strategy.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Wetaskiwin.
Today we're talking about the 2022 budget, and several things are very clear. During the election, many parties made substantial commitments on mental health. The cornerstone of the Liberal commitment was the Canada Mental Health Transfer, beginning with $250 million for 2021-22. The Liberals made an agreement with the NDP, and many elements of that agreement remain highly secret. Subsequently, the Canada Mental Health Transfer has been shelved. Canadians deserve to know what other Liberal platform commitments have been negotiated away in their deal with the NDP.
The Honourable Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Mr. Speaker, I usually respect the questions from this member, but I find that quite annoying in that it is everything on mental health and and addiction is built upon. There is nothing being traded away. This is a high priority in our government, and I really think that that was really a despicable question.
All right. Again, like I offered earlier today, I mean, if you're feeling a little stressed out, it's really nice outside. L'honorable député de Mirabel.
The honourable member for Mirabel. Mr. Speaker, it's very concerning to see that the Globe and Mail revealed what's happening at the CRA. Half of employees in a division that is responsible for taxing multinationals said that they suffered bullying last year at work. They were pressured to approve favorable treatment involving millions of dollars. Mr. Speaker, being intimidated at work is always unacceptable. Does the minister think it's acceptable that her own employees are being pressured at work in order to collect less rather than more money? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I have worked in the social sector and I have worked with people who have suffered bullying and violence. And so I would like to say that I denounce all forms of intimidation. And I would like to reassure my colleague that everything has been reviewed by an arm's-length third party. And the Minister of National Revenue cannot interfere in the administration of the CRA. The Honourable Member. Mr. Speaker, we all know that this minister never answers the question. I'm not trying to call into question the third-party review, but clearly this agreement with a business was controversial, given that half of employees said that they suffered intimidation. The CRA is supposed to be a watchguard for taxpayers, but this dog seems to be trying to bite members of its own family. Is it regular practice at the CRA to pressure employees to approve these controversial agreements? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that this is a good watchdog. And the Bloc Québécois, they're always in opposition and they can't do anything. They should at least try to be well informed. That's the only thing they can do, Mr. Speaker.
Member. The Honourable Member for Fort McMurray Cold Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government's failure to plan has prevented Canadians from being able to access basic government services. People can't get through by phone or in person to Service Canada. In fact, the delays in passport processing have effectively ground Services Canada locations all across the country to a halt. It has become so dire that some people are charging upwards of $50 an hour to stand in line for people desperate to get an in-person appointment. The Harper government introduced a 10-year passport, but this government, this Liberal government, have they decided to introduce a 10-year wait list?
The Honourable Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said before in this House, there is an unprecedented demand when it comes to accessing passports. Mr. Speaker, we have put a number of initiatives in place to help deal with this. We have a simplified processing to replace expired passports. We've opened more client counters in passport offices. We've operated extended hours and used overtime in passport offices and processing in call centres. We've created 3 additional application processing centres, expanded passport intake in 303 Service Canada centres, hired 500 additional staff and continued to hire and train more, opened 12 offices over the weekend in the busiest centres around the country, and will continue to work really hard to ensure that we're serving Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Mr. Speaker, despite all that, the horrors of the Out of Service Canada office in Saskatoon continue. Margaret is 86 years old and the nicest lady you can find. She was struggling to get through on the phone, so she went to the Saskatoon office in person. The staff refused to meet with her for, get this, not having booked an online appointment.
Shameful.
Mr. Speaker, our seniors and indeed all Canadians deserve better than this. Does the minister have even an ounce of compassion for Margaret and all the people being mistreated in Saskatoon because of the minister's lack of planning?
Good question.
The Honourable Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
Of course, I have compassion for everyone across the country because there is an unprecedented demand in accessing these services. I was in Saskatoon on Friday, in fact, and visited the Service Canada Centre there and spoke with the employees who are working around the clock to address this unprecedented demand. They are working evenings, they are working weekends, they are doing everything they can to serve Canadians, but right now there are more Canadians than at any time ever before looking to renew their passports because they want to travel, and we are going to do everything we can to serve them as best as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Speaker, a constituent of mine from Kelowna Lake Country did the right thing, applied for passport renewals in person at a passport office, and was told by Service Canada staff that 2 months before traveling was plenty of time. The passports never arrived, and she will likely have to cancel her family trip at great cost and disappointment. Service Canada told MPs that they expect lengthy passport delays. This is another mess from this government. When will the minister provide clarity to my constituent and Canadians on passport processing?
Bravo, great question.
The Honourable Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I understand that this is a frustrating process for many Canadians, but over the past 2 years, many passports have expired, and with the lifting of restrictions, many Canadians want to travel at the same time. We are doing everything we can, and Service Canada employees are helping them. If there is an urgent request, they should make that known when they arrive at a Service Canada centre. They are ensuring that transfers happen, and if there is an issue, to call the call centre. Of course, MPs have access to a special regional inquiries unit that they can also call, and Service Canada will assist as best as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dorval-Lachine-LaSalle. Mr. Speaker, for many farmers, 2022 started with uncertainty, and planning their operations is facing many obstacles. There is an increase in droughts and floods, as well as outbreaks of illnesses that affect farm animals, like avian flu. That's just some examples. Can the Minister of Agriculture tell this House what is being done to help farmers to deal with these significant risks? The Honourable Minister of Agriculture. I'd like to thank my colleague for her support to the agricultural sector. We know that this is a difficult year for our farmers. In order to help them deal with these situations, we recently extended the registration period for the Agri-Stability Program. It is now the 30th of June instead of the 30th of April. That will give producers more time to deal with their risk management strategies.
Lake Centre, Lanigan.
Mr. Speaker, with global supply chains struggling and a war in Ukraine, Canadian agriculture is more important than ever. Farmers in my riding are concerned that the Liberals want to meddle with the Pest Control Products Act, adding more red tape for them to deal with and favoring activism over science-based decisions. Our farmers have always been tremendous stewards of the environment. What makes this NDP Liberal government or coalition think that they have any expertise or right to tell our farmers how to feed the world?
Great question.
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je veux assurer mon collègue qu'on reconnaît absolument que nos producteurs.
I'd like to assure my colleague that we are very committed to help our farmers take care of our environment. Our lands are extremely valuable, and we will continue to ensure that the agency will do more to ensure that we meet consumer expectations while recognizing that our producers need tools. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. Mr. Speaker, whether in manufacturing, farming, or the tourism sector, our business owners are having a great deal of trouble due to the labor shortage, and it's worse among Francophones. There is a great deal of paperwork, and delays can last up to 30 months, 2.5 years. Does the Minister of Immigration know about the irreparable harm this is causing our economy? What will he do now to resolve the problem and respect our Francophone entrepreneurs? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Immigration. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. This is a very important question. Immigration is essential to fighting the labour shortage, and I'd like to note to my colleague and to this House that over the first quarter of this year, we processed more than 100,000 work permit requests, nearly twice as many as those processed during the same period in 2021. We will continue to ensure that Canadian and Quebec employers have access to the workers they need in order to support our economic recovery.
Member for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
Mr. Speaker, just last year, the NDP voted with the Conservatives not just once, but 4 times for the production of the Winnipeg Microbiology Lab documents, which the Liberals have still failed to provide. Just last week in the Foreign Affairs Committee, the NDP flip-flopped and voted with the Liberals to shut down the committee's inquiry, blocking production of those very same documents. What did the minister promise the NDP to make them complicit in yet another Liberal cover-up?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, and of course those documents were made available through NSICOP, and the Conservatives said they didn't want to see them. So then we created a new process through an MOU to have an independent panel of jurists who would determine what could be made public and what couldn't to protect national security. And did they decide to participate? No. So I'm confused, Mr. Speaker. Do they want to see the documents or do they not? We have 2 processes, 2 offers for them to see them. They continue to say no. It leads one to believe they just want to play a partisan game and that it's all a big joke, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Guelph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My riding of Guelph continues to see significant growth in green technology and agriculture, sectors that we know are vital to Canada's economic prosperity through organizations like Innovation Guelph and BioEnterprise. Can the minister responsible for the Federal Economic Development Agency for Southern Ontario inform the House about the measures our government is taking to support the economic growth in these sectors while enhancing the lives of those living in Guelph and Wellington County?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from the riding of Guelph for his commitment to supporting job creation and economic growth in his riding. I was pleased to visit Guelph last Friday to announce $10 million for green tech development through 6 regional innovation centres, as well as over $2.6 million in support for community revitalisation and tourism projects for the people of Guelph and Wellington County. Our government will continue to make investments like these that grow our economy and improve the lives of Canadians. Hear, hear.
I'm hearing a lot of chatter here. I don't know what's been going on in between question periods. So some friendly banter going here, and I maybe call it off. The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
One of the 231 calls for justice calls for the full implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This government committed to do so in passing Bill C-15. But in courts this week, federal lawyers now say UNDRIP is only an important interpretive aid and a process for discussions. So which is it? Will this Minister of Justice stand to confirm that the rights of Indigenous people in Canada are indeed substantive as stated in UNDRIP?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Honourable Member for her question. Mr. Speaker, UNDRIP is a foundational document which we feel will be transformative in restarting the reconciliation process and fulfilling the real promise of Canada moving forward. Mr. Speaker, I also point out that my predecessor, Minister of Justice, implemented a directive on litigation. We're doing our best every day to implement that directive. Mr. Speaker, these are 2 measures that we feel will help build trust, will help build the process of reconciliation as we move forward implementing UNDRIP.
The Honourable Member for Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, we waited for over a year for the government to honor its commitment and promise to the arts community to hold a national arts summit. We've seen the visceral economic and societal damage that this delay has wreaked upon workers. I called for it in February, and then I called for it again in March. And finally, the government got around to it. Can the Minister of Canadian Heritage share with us what came out of this summit? What concrete action can we expect to see? What can I tell my constituents who've lost their jobs and their livelihoods? Will we see real action, or was a year-long delay just for lip service?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for his sudden interest in Canadian heritage. He talks about February, but perhaps he doesn't remember that the pandemic was raging on. We have been there for our artists since the beginning, and we will continue to be. The pandemic has been tough, but the worst is behind us. It's time to rebuild and look to the future. We were happy to welcome the entire cultural community to Ottawa this week for the Cultural Summit. Together, we will find long-term solution to strengthen our culture, and our jobs depend on it, Mr. Speaker. Thank you so much.
And that's all the time with question period today. Thank you so much. That was great, guys. I thought it was great. All right, we have a few unanimous consent. The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre, and I'm hoping she did talk to the other parties.
And if you seek it, I hope you will find consent for the following motion. That given that, 1, grassroots actions are taking place today at local, regional, national, and international levels in recognition of the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. 2, Indigenous women and girls still face unacceptable and rising rates of violence, with 56% of Indigenous women having experienced assault and 46% having experienced sexual assault, and 64% of First Nations and 65% of Métis women having experienced violent victimization, 42% of Indigenous women having experienced physical or sexual abuse during childhood, and Indigenous women being at least 4.5 times more likely to be murdered than non-Indigenous women. And 3, we have witnessed decades of insufficient action from all levels of government to address this crisis with the urgency it deserves. The House call on the government to A, immediately implement Call to Justice 3.2 of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. B, provide adequate, stable, equitable, and ongoing funding for Indigenous-centered and community-based health and wellness services that are accessible and culturally appropriate. And C, meet the health and wellness needs of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion will please say nay. Agreed? The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood, I believe, has a motion.
Mr. Speaker, upon consultation with the members for Don Valley West, Selkirk, Montville, Saint-Jean, and Edmonton, Strathcona, and others, if you seek it, I believe you will find there's unanimous consent for the following motion.
Kara-Murza, a trusted leader in the Russian human rights and democracy movement, was unjustly arrested by the Putin regime for having temerity of telling the truth. And whereas Vladimir Kara-Murza has been poisoned twice